and remind everybody that this meeting is being recorded. So, and will be shared after the presentation on the chapter YouTube channel. Let's see. So it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Dr. Mrna Jain, the Director of the Adult CF Program at Northwestern Medicine, and Dr. Michelle Prickett, the Associate Director of the Adult CF Program at Northwestern Medicine. So thank you both for joining us today and sharing the latest and greatest on the COVID vaccine. Today's agenda, we will be covering COVID-19 and the current CF stats, the current vaccines that are available and the status, our state distribution plan, such as it is, the local distribution plan for the greater Chicago area, considerations that should be taken into account when taking the vaccine, what to expect, some resources from the foundation so that you can keep up to date on the latest and greatest. And then we'll go into any questions that might not have been answered during the actual presentation. So feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to ask your questions, and we will do our best to accommodate everybody's submissions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Prickett to go over some of the current stats.
Great, thank you, David. And thanks for everyone for coming to learn more about how we can protect ourselves from COVID moving forward. So wanted to start a little bit about background with COVID-19 and CF. And so the CF Foundation has been getting weekly reports from the registry. And as of January of 2021, which is this month, crazy not to think, about 2.5% of individuals with CF have been infected with COVID. And again, that's similar to the general population, but lower than the general population. So that's less than half of the infection rate. What you see is our local, this is from the New York Times, they have their COVID tracking. There's multiple COVID tracking, but this is Illinois' rates over time. And so what you see recently is, we've had essentially two surges here. Our summer was quite flat, but our fall surge was fairly sizable and included more than just the Chicago area, included pretty much the entire state. We are on the downward trend for cases, deaths, and hospitalizations, and we hope that that continues, and we hope that the vaccine will help to keep us moving in that direction. Next slide. So current vaccines that we have there's been two that have been authorized for use by the FDA under an emergency use authorization. And both of these are messenger RNA vaccines, so mRNA vaccines produced by either Pfizer or Moderna. Just so that we all understand the technology and the science behind this technology has been started, the ideas were actually started in the 1980s. It has been growing over the last 20 years and is highly adaptable, but this is not something new. It's something that we are currently using, but the science and the basic science behind it has been work in progress over several decades. So the FDA indicated that these were for emergency use because they were highly efficacious for symptomatic illnesses. And so one of the triggers for these studies, and we'll talk about one of the studies just as an example, was symptomatic illness. And it was consistent results in across all groups, including those that were high risk. Both of the vaccines were over 90% efficacious in preventing symptomatic COVID, which is fantastic. We also know that some patients with CF took part in the clinical trials, but we don't have any specific numbers. So looking at each of the vaccines and what are under studies, so the Pfizer was in early December, it's 16 and up. Moderna is essentially the same. It has some slight changes to their packaging of how it works, so it requires less freezer storage conditions, and that one's for 18 and up. It came out the week after Pfizer. So they've been around for at least a month now. There's also several additional vaccines in clinical trials. AstraZeneca has been approved in Europe. Janssen, which is Johnson & Johnson, has a one-shot that will potentially be going under FDA review in the next few weeks. And Moderna is also looking at ages of 12 to 17. So very much what we're used to seeing in the CF community. We're seeing drugs that come out for our adult population, and they're doing clinical trials for younger and younger populations so that we can hit all comers. Next slide. So the question I keep getting is, mRNA vaccines, these are new, how do they work? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And so on our next slide, we'll see a schematic of really how this functions. And so over on the left, you see a coronavirus, and you see the little spikes, corona's crown, and these spikes are on the outside. And it's that spike protein that lets it attach to the cells and actually get into the cells and cause infections. And so what they did was they took that spike protein and they took the recipe for it, the mRNA that will build that protein with amino acids, and they packaged it into are called lipid nanoparticles, but they're little fat globules is how you can think about it. And so they put all these recipes for mRNA in fat globules, and then they actually took those little fat globules and they injected into muscle. And once it gets into the cells, fat actually can go right through cellular walls, gets into the cells, and then goes into the protoplasm of the cell, so within the cell itself, and it uses the machineries of cells. So, and it has this recipe, and it starts to make the proteins for the spike protein in very, very high volumes. And so it presents it on the outside of the cell so that our own immune systems can see it as foreign and actually start to make antibodies to protect us if we ever see the actual protein itself in a native virus. But all you're getting is the mRNA, and then it's using all your own equipment. So how do I like to think about that? Next slide. So I like to think about this as, go back ones. This is really your kitchen. So you're using everything, but you're getting a new recipe. So the only thing that's coming that you're getting with this vaccine is a recipe for telling the kitchen to make something new. But all the pots and pans, all the stuff, all the ingredients are all your own machinery. Everything that you're making to make these spike proteins that are found to be foreign are all your own apparatus. So it's really kind of tricking your own immune system to make something that shouldn't be there. And then when it's recognized it shouldn't be there, it tells your immune system this is what you need to make. And then the beauty of the mRNA vaccines are the recipe disappears. So once you figure out it's a bad recipe, you just throw it out. That mRNA degrades rapidly, which is why it requires some of the storage conditions that are much colder than our typical vaccines, but it degrades rapidly and goes away. And you're left with just the proteins that get exposed, and then they also get degraded. And so again, you're priming your immune system to detect this vaccine in a very elegant and sophisticated way, but you're not getting a lot of extra leftover things. So it's probably the best analogy I have. Next slide. But we talked about this being new, but really it was, these two vaccines, both Pfizer and Mrna, were brought about in the same way that all of our other drug trials have occurred. So again, all the drug trials throughout history and all the drug trials we're familiar with in the CF community were all performed very similar to how this one was performed. So there's a lot of clinical discovery and the basic science that happened over those decades that we talked about. And then once we understood back in January of last year, once they knew what the protein was, the sequence to the protein, they actually started manufacturing and started making these vaccines, and then they went to phase 1 clinical trials. And again, phase 1, they do on very few number of patients. You're really looking at safety and saying, is this a safe trial? And then if it's positive, it's a helpful trial, you're going to move to phase 2, which occurred, and that's looking at dosing. And then if that's a positive trial, it's going to go to phase 3. And phase 3 is the efficacy. How effective does this vaccine or drug work? And if it's found to be highly effective based off of the design that's predetermined and predetermined clinical endpoints, it goes to the FDA for approval. And so that's absolutely what happened with both the Pfizer and the Mrna, as well as the other ones in development. They're all going through the normal process through FDA approval, albeit rapid because of a lot of factors, including a lot of people working on it and a lot of highly infectious virus causing a lot of infections within the community. Next slide. So what are the endpoints for the vaccine? So the endpoint for the vaccine, if you can advance, is to reduce infections. And so how is this done? So you have two arms, and we're familiar in CF with having arms of studies. So in one arm, you have a vaccine is given, the other arm, you're gonna have a placebo given. And then once you receive those treatments, you're going to monitor for new infections. And so how vaccine trials go, different from the clinical trials that we're used to, is you're going to have predetermined endpoints. So if you can advance one, you're going to see there's going to be checkpoints, again, with interim analysis. And those interim analyses are going to be predetermined within the course of the trial before anyone ever gets a vaccine. You can advance one more time. The outcomes are going to be based off of efficacy. How well does it work? And so what you can see from the formula is the efficacy is the number of infections in the vaccine group versus the number of infections in the placebo group. So if you have a lot of infections at your first interim analysis or early interim analysis, you are going to reach your predetermined endpoint, which is one of the reasons why we saw these come to market so quickly, is there's so much infections out there. But it was based off of that calculation that was, again, statistically derived before anyone received this. And that's why, that's why they were able to get through these vaccine studies so quickly, is because there are so many infections out there. So on the next slide, we'll see about the actual trial design. And so this was a randomized controlled clinical trial, just like we're used to seeing in all of our CF drug studies. It enrolled about 4,000. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the Pfizer study here just for continuity. And so we don't have questions, but understand the Moderna trial is a very, very similar outcomes, and it's essentially the same protein that's being designed. So these two drugs or true vaccines are almost identical for all effective purposes, and their data supports that as well. So in the Pfizer study, there's two arms, and it was a 1-to-1. So for each person getting a treatment, another person got placebo. The treatment for Pfizer is about, it's 300 micrograms of the nanoparticles for treatment versus the same volume of just saline or salt water. And participants received 2 injections 21 days apart. Same drug, 21 days apart. Their primary endpoint was how well it prevented, or how it reduced confirmed COVID-19, symptomatic COVID-19, 1 week after the second dose. And this was through either with serologic or virologic evidence of infections. They also looked at secondary endpoints, which included efficacy against severe COVID, or which was defined as severe systemic illnesses, those folks that we've been seeing in our ICUs. They also looked at secondary outcomes of adverse reactions, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So how well did it work? Of the 43,000, they split it nearly equally, 21,700 and some per group. And in the treatment group, after 7 days of the second dose, there was only 8 that had symptomatic infections in the treatment group versus 162 in the placebo group. So again, that gives you an effective rate of 95% effective in preventing COVID-19 in those that receive treatment versus those in the placebo. For severe COVID, there was 1 in the treatment group and 9 in the placebo group. So it also had a significant reduction in severe cases of COVID in those receiving the vaccine versus those who received placebo. And the really important part to me is that there was similar vaccine efficacy, which was anywhere from 90 to 100% observed across all subgroups. This included race, gender, age. The highest was lowest of 16, but the highest age in these included in the study was actually 93. So they really included a section of the population that represented the United States. That was one of the recommendations and requirements of the NIH and the FDA when they went into this, was that it was a representative population, what we would see. And what you can see from subgroup analysis was you're still receiving anywhere from 90 to 100%. So there wasn't a significant decline in one subgroup. And that's really important because it's going to have a more real world outcome than what we might see in a clinical trial, because it's really representing what we would see. Next trial. So this is the efficacy kind of broken down into events. And so the The blue events are those on placebo. The red line is those that received the vaccine. The trial name was BNT something something. But each of these little dots you'll see are symptomatic COVID infections, and the solid ones are actually the severe. And so there's only one severe in the red. There's multiple in the blue, but you see this divergence very early on with treatment. And it was maintained after 21 days after that second dose. So it was a really nice prolonged, flattening of that curve with the vaccine that was fairly consistent. It only included up to about 2 months afterwards, because that was really the first interim analysis. And so as we move forward, we'll get more information, we'll continue to gather, but their first interim analysis is really when they found that they had the efficacy outcomes that they were predetermined. And that's why it came to market as quickly as it did. And you can see that really in this first graph, kind of very visually. Next slide. So what about side effects? Now that we're starting to vaccinate people, we want to see what the side effects showed. And so this is, again, the Pfizer side effects studies, and they broke it down into different predetermined categories. Mild, moderate, severe, and then grade 4 were anaphylactic and other kind of severe reactions. And what you see, and this is the data that they presented off of the 55 age and above, and it's very similar to the lower age group. I just brought this one up for simplicity of presentation. But you can see that with the first dose, you do see anywhere from a few percentage up to about 30% in the treatment arms with things like fatigue, headache, and muscle pain. Those are fairly common with the first dose, and it was a little bit more common with the second dose. There were some severe and a couple of grade 4, but they're kind of intermixed between the placebo and the treatment arm. Next slide. So the most common reactions, again, were fatigue, headaches, muscle and joint pains. And having received my vaccine, I will tell you that kind of holds true. Up to 45% of those receiving the vaccine or placebo used an antipyretic after administration, so Tylenol, ibuprofen. They also had unsolicited adverse reactions. We looked at the ones that they queried for, asked for, but the ones that came up that were not asked but were reported during the trial were temporary lymphadenopathy near the injection site. You saw that in about 58 reported in treatment with 6 reported in the placebo. And then severe adverse reactions were minimal. So 0.6% in treatment, 0.5% placebo, again in the Pfizer study, very similar to what Moderna reported. And then the CDC has been collecting data of those that have been vaccinated. And so they just reported through their MMWR, severe allergic reactions are rare. They had 11 cases per million doses within the first month of distribution. So again, severe allergic reactions have been very rare with this vaccine, and it's still highly efficacious. So what about kids? So clinical trials, Pfizer's studying 12 to 17. Mrna has plans to start their trial soon. Again, this is a tiered approach similar to the way the CF community has studied modulators. And I understand that that Trikafta was just approved for our younger age groups as of yesterday. I was on a call. So we're familiar with how this is going to work. It should be, again, quick trials. They have the infrastructure. They understand what they're looking for. And it's based off of number of infections, really. So if infections remain high, we should expect to see these going through in a similar fashion.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Prickett. Now I think we'll turn it over to Dr. Jain to share the state and local distribution plans.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michelle. I think it was great how Michelle, Dr. Prickett took us through the data that shows the efficacy. I just want to make a comment that I know there's been a lot of concern about how rapid this vaccine was developed and came to be approved, or at least have emergency authorization. But I think it's important to remember that, these trials were very, very large trials, 30 to 40,000 people in each trial. And that's normally what we see in these vaccine trials. That's the number of patients. it just happened rapidly because we are in the middle of a pandemic. There's lots of infections going on, and the science behind it is very solid. And so I have a lot of confidence that this is going to work. So I just wanted to sort of share my thoughts about the efficacy data. But beyond that, the big question is, when can we start getting the vaccine to our patients? And it's been incredibly frustrating for everybody, as healthcare providers, as patients, as family members, to not have better clarity about how this is going to roll out. And I think there are several reasons for why we don't have clarity. One is that there has not been a plan in terms of how it should roll out. Each state, each county, each healthcare system is sort of left to its own decisions about how they're going to roll out the vaccines. There are CDC guidelines about how it should roll out, but every locality is not beholden to those guidelines. They can do what they choose to do. And the other issue is nobody really knows how many vaccines they're going to get on a week-to-week basis because of the limited supply. And so it's hard to make any plans in terms of how to roll it out 2-3 weeks down the road when you don't know how many vaccines you may be getting in a given week. I think that is getting better. I've been reading things where the healthcare providers, hospitals, systems are getting better information about how many vaccines they're actually getting. So hopefully that will improve as time passes. Well, anyway, that is my preamble. What I've listed on this slide is the state distribution plan, which was announced last week. And what this shows is how the state is planning to roll out the vaccines. At the very bottom, you can see what the estimated population is of each phase of the distribution. So phase 1A, which started in December, which included healthcare personnel, people in long-term care facilities, and other people in congregate care resident staff. And this was phase 1A, and we're in the middle of that. There are about 850,000 people who fit this category. And then just this past Monday, we started phase 1B. You can see that encompasses about 3.2 million people. And this includes people over the age of 65 and above. And then another category of frontline essential workers. And I won't go through the whole list, but some of these categories include firefighters, law enforcement officers, grocery workers, agriculture workers. You can read through the list there, teachers in the education sector, and a few others. So that's about 3.2 million people. And then the next phase, which they're, in my next slide, I'll show you when they think they maybe get to the next phase, which is phase 1C. And this is going to be important for our CF patients, at least those who are over the age of 16, because that is when they're going to start rolling this out to people who are between the ages of 16 and 64 who have comorbid conditions, and that CF would be considered a comorbid condition. And then other essential workers, this could include people in transportation and logistics, water and wastewater. Parenthetically, I should mention, going back to 1B, if you are a CF patient and you are considered a frontline essential worker, you're in that profession, then you would qualify under 1B. You won't necessarily have to wait for 1C. So I just want to clarify that as well. And then finally, phase 2 will be everyone else, essentially. So anybody over the age of 16. What about the next slide, please? And then we got some clarity about the local planning in Chicago. And it mirrors pretty closely. I know this may be hard to read, but it mirrors pretty closely to what the state plan is going to be. So again, 1A, which began on December 15th, people in long-term facilities and healthcare workers. It is anticipated that most people in Chicago will be vaccinated by the end of January who fit this category. And as I said, 1B started this past Monday, January 25th, and includes all Chicagoans 65 and older, in addition to people who are in correctional settings, maybe in homeless shelters, in other residential settings with local outbreaks. And then again, frontline essential workers, including teachers, public transit workers, postal workers, and the like. And then finally, it's anticipated, and this could change, so don't take this as gospel, but it is anticipated that in Chicago, people between the ages of 16 and 64 with comorbid condition, including CF, March 29th is a targeted date to when this might be rolling out to that group. Again, I will stay tuned to see if that changes, maybe more rapid, maybe later, but that's a targeted date for now. And then also all other essential workers, as we showed before in the slide. Then finally, it's anticipated sometime at the end of May, in early June, that everyone else would be eligible to get the vaccine, assuming no hiccups. So in terms of considerations for who should get COVID, it is recommended that everyone get vaccinated even if you've had a previous known infection with COVID. And the reason for this is that the response you get to the vaccine is, in terms of the immune response, is greater with the vaccine than you do with the COVID infection. You should wait until you're 90 days out from the infection to get the vaccine, but you should still get the vaccine. And this would also include patients who have had an organ transplant. If you're in quarantine, because you may have had an exposure, you should wait until you finish your quarantine period to get the vaccine. If you have not gotten the flu shot yet, it is recommended that you wait at least 14 days after you get the flu vaccine to get the COVID vaccine. So if you haven't gotten the flu shot yet, I would recommend you get it now or soon before the end of March. Individuals with CF will likely get vaccinated before the rest of the family, and this is going to lead to some decisions that families will have to make with respect to how to handle social distancing and such. But they may be different time frames, different groups for patients versus family members. And then individuals with transplants, whether it's lung or liver or some other organ, should also get transplanted. Now, in terms of the cost of the vaccine is covered by the US government. It will be covered by most insurances. If you have questions related to cost, please call Compass at CFF, and they should be able to provide you some guidance if they're asking you for you to pay for the vaccine. Next slide. So what to expect? I think Dr. Prickett went through this already. The two vaccines that are approved right now are 2 injections. One is the Pfizer vaccine is 21 days apart. The Mrna vaccine is 28 days. It's important to remember that it is not a live virus. It's mRNA, so you cannot get COVID-19 from the vaccination itself. It's just the mRNA, not the whole virus. And the side effects, I think Dr. Prickett covered very well already. You see the list there. A severe reaction, while possible, are relatively rare. And one thing I just want to say about in terms of the vaccine, a third vaccine is supposed to report out the results hopefully early next week. This is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The differentiating feature about this vaccine is that it is an attenuated virus vaccine, so more of a classic vaccine related that we think about with the flu, but it's only a single dose. It doesn't require the cold refrigeration, and so that might help with some of the distribution issues that we've been experiencing with the vaccines that exist right now. Next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. So on behalf of the foundation, we are continuing to update our COVID-19 FAQs on the cff.org website. We also issued a statement on January 7th that obviously strongly encourages everyone with CF to talk to their care team about getting vaccinated. We continue to focus on educating decision makers about the complexities of people with CF and why we should receive priority access to the COVID vaccine. And all of that information is available on the cff.org website as well. And then in addition to our local care center town hall today, the Foundation hosted a community town hall on the COVID vaccine with a little more in-depth information and some more reporting from our leadership there. But if you do have additional questions that we can't cover here today, we make sure to refer you to our patient assistance service, Compass, which is available. You can access that easily through 844-COMPASS or compass@cff.org. But first and foremost, always make sure you go to your care center as well for questions regarding your individual circumstance. So without further ado, I think we're going to go to some of the questions and answers that are the questions that were submitted during registration. So Dr. Jain and Dr. Prickett, if you would be so kind, let's see, one of the first questions is, if CF patients are relatively high priority for receiving the vaccine, does that apply to those who we live with? I think you touched on that. And would family members qualify for getting an early vaccine if living together?
I think the way the distribution plan is now, the families would be treated as in phase 2, and CF patient would be in phase 1C. And so I don't think that if you're a family member who lives with a CF patient, you would go higher on the priority list.
Great. Another question that came in, and I think we touched on it in the beginning, but can you summarize how cases of CF patients who have contracted COVID-19 have played out so far in their severity and treatment?
I think Michelle touched upon what the national registry has shown. I think from our perspective, just at our Northwestern Medical Center, we've had a handful of people get COVID infection. Fortunately, none of them have developed severe manifestations of COVID, and no one has ended up in the hospital as a complication of their COVID infection. So knock on wood, I think our patients are very good at socially distancing. They've been living their whole life with some of these recommendations that have been put forth now. So hopefully we can keep that going, but we have personally not had anybody who had a severe complication related to COVID infection. And that sort of, I think, replicates what we've been seeing on a national level as well.
I'm going to add to that. I do think it's important. We do have new preventative treatments for early infections, so some of the monoclonals. So for people with pre-existing conditions, if you do get diagnosed, please call your center and inquire about some of the early phase treatments to start to help ensure that we don't have severe infections. So, but just as Dr. Jain said, that we've had we've been spared any severe outcomes, at least locally, that we're aware of. And we'd like to keep it that way. So if you do get exposed, you do get infected, please reach out. There are some early options, but they need to be initiated within the first couple days. And so if you suspect it, get tested and reach out to your care center.
Great, thank you. Another question, if the vaccine is available at the same time you are in a clinical trial, will you have to choose to leave the trial or take the vaccine?
I think that's on it depends on the specific study. I think that if that issue does come up, I would recommend that you take the vaccine and let your research team know that take the vaccine, and that can be something that can be discussed with a sponsor with respect to ongoing participation in a clinical trial or not. But I would not let trial participation get in the way of getting the vaccine in an expedited fashion.
Thank you. Another question was, how effective will the vaccine be if for some reason people can only get one dose of the 2-dose vaccine? Or if there's a lag between the 2 doses?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. The way the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were developed was with 2 doses. And so the 95% efficacy is based on getting both doses. Likelihood is that there would be some protection with just 1 dose. We don't know how long acting would be and how robust the protection would be. So it is a bit of a black box. So we just don't know for sure.
Gotcha. Another question, will CF centers be reaching out to patients to schedule vaccines at the care centers when they're available?
As of right now, I can only speak to what Northwestern is doing. Right now, Northwestern, it's kind of outside of the physician's purview. Northwestern is actually approaching our patients specifically by age and are reaching out with an invitation to schedule within one of our vaccination clinics. So we have not received any vaccine in our clinics to date. I'm not sure if that will be in the short term, the model that they're going to be using. It could be different across care centers. So I would say reach out to your specific care center, ask what the protocol is. Specifically at Northwestern, it's being handled centrally with an invitation to schedule, and it's outside of the providers being able to have it within our clinics. So that's what I know about that.
Thank you. Another question, how soon do people see allergic reactions occur if somebody has a reaction to the vaccine? Is it generally pretty immediate?
So the anaphylactic reactions that were reported are typically within the first 15 minutes. They have all been reversible, and one of the guidelines is to be evaluated for 15 minutes post-vaccination. And so for our center, there is a place to be monitored for 15 minutes. Those that have a history of prior allergic reaction to other vaccines are still eligible for this vaccine. The only contraindication would be if you have had allergic reaction to specifically one of the COVID vaccines or one of the components. And the only component in the Pfizer Moderna is the compound in Miralax or Go Lightly. And so it's the PEG component in Miralax and Go Lightly is the one component that could induce an allergic reaction. So for most comers, especially those with egg allergies, it's not an issue with Pfizer or Moderna. So they can proceed with the vaccine. They should be monitored, but it's very low risk from the numbers that we have seen so far. 11 in a million, so.
Great. It looks like you've been answering a lot of questions in the chat
right.
feature. So thank you for staying ahead of a lot of stuff. So forgive me if I'm repeating any of these. Let's see. Dr. Jain mentioned a target date for vaccination of CF patients. Is that the target for starting or finishing vaccination of the local population?
That's the targeted beginning date. The anticipation is that that'll roll out over the subsequent month or 2. So more likely April and May are when the vast majority of our patients are targeted to get it. It could happen sooner. I mean, I think one of the things to keep an eye out is in your own local community, just keep an eye out to sometimes people are getting access to vaccines because there's something left over or you can sign up unexpectedly. So it is a little frustrating because you don't know, you can't really plan that in advance, but it is important just to keep your eyes and ears open for anything that might open up.
Great. Another question that came in, if Cook County has sent an email for me to get the vaccine, should they proceed?
Absolutely.
I would assume yes.
Absolutely. It's all the same vaccine. Doesn't matter where you get it. You need to go get it if you can get it.
A little confusion around if you live in DuPage County, do you still plan to get the vaccine through your care center in Chicago, or will it be rolled out closer to, where they reside in DuPage County?
You should look at all the options. So it's being distributed through this nationally to the state and then to counties. So certain counties have actually gotten a higher share of vaccines per capita. So you should certainly look at all your options and take the first one that comes available is kind of the general consensus. So
Right.
if you live there, you don't need to come downtown and vice versa.
Excellent. And one of our last questions, have you heard any information on the new COVID strains emerging? And do you think the vaccine will protect against these new strains?
Well, we don't know for sure yet. One of the things we don't know is how much of these strains were present when the trials were done. My suspicion is there were some of these strains were in the communities where the trials were done. Some testing that's been done in the laboratory using these variant strains suggests, at least with the UK strain, the vaccine works very, very well against that strain. There may be slightly less efficacy with the South African strain, but it still seemed to work reasonably well. And we don't have much data on the Brazilian vaccine variant yet. So the overall view is that we think it's still going to work, maybe not quite as well as some of these variants. There's still every reason to go ahead and get the vaccine, because even if it doesn't work completely well, you still be afforded some protection.
Excellent. And on the same topic, would the same be applicable for people with antibodies? How are antibodies reacting to the UK strain? Or do we have much information on that?
Is a question like if you've already had a COVID infection?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. I think that there should be some protection if you have your own antibodies. But there may be some slightly higher risk of getting a reinfection based on what we understand about how antibodies work against these variant strains if you had the sort of the baseline strain when early in the pandemic.
Awesome. I think that's about all the questions. Oh, well, one question that did just pop in. Have any CF patients had long-term effects after getting COVID, kind of those residual ongoing problems, and how did it affect their lung function? Do we have much data on that, or?
Go ahead, Michelle.
I don't think we have enough data that's not just anecdotal. I think the problem that I see with COVID is that it's so difficult to predict. So if someone gets it, what their outcome will be, what will be long-term, what will be the resolution. We would expect that you might have a change in lung function with any sort of virus. That's kind of the typical, what we have seen historically with exacerbations leading to decreases in lung function. But I don't think we have enough data to date to say that this would be a clear issue. And again, many people that get this have very mild symptoms. And so it's hard to say what will happen. So prevention is, an ounce of prevention is definitely worth a pound of cure here. So looking at all your options in terms of what vaccine is available to you as quickly as possible, and informing those around you. I did see one question that I don't know the answer to, but I will pose about the 1C patients, or if patients are eligible or their family members would also be included. I don't think for adults it's household contacts. However, I do hear in the pediatric community, if children have parents that are caregivers that are immunocompromised, that may be consideration for household members. And so I did hear mention of Lurie looking into that. And so that would be one possibility for if there's any pediatric families that may be an effort out there in the pediatric world that we haven't been seeing in the adult world.
Awesome. Another question, how often will we need to get revaccinated in the future to maintain our immunity? Will this be a yearly thing, do we know, or?
Great question. We don't know the answer is a short answer. There's a chance, there are coronaviruses that are endemic that we have been in our environment for years and decades. And whether this novel coronavirus becomes one of those coronaviruses in the future, there's a possibility of that happening. Normally when we get a coronavirus that's been in our community, we get mild symptoms. We don't get vaccinated for them. We may feel not great for a couple of days, but then we bounce back. Does this novel coronavirus become sort of like that in the future, or does it change in a way that it still causes severe illness in a significant proportion of our patients? We just don't know the answer to that. And those kinds of things are going to impact whether we need to be revaccinated every year or whether it just becomes part of our milieu going forward. So remain tuned for that kind of information.
So I am aware that Moderna is working on a variant booster. So that, again, as we think about mRNA, it's a recipe. And so they're actually working on different recipes to put within the same kind of delivery pathway or delivery vesicle. And so they are looking with some of these newer variants that are more severe or contagious of trying to augment existing immunity to cover these new variants. And so we may be looking at boosters that are slightly different than our initial series. That would not be an unreasonable expectation. And the science supports that you can make these relatively small variations without big to-do. It should work the same.
Excellent. Well, thank you. It looks like that's about all of the questions that were submitted in the chat feature, and I know we're coming to the end of our time together. And obviously, I know Dr. Prickett and Dr. Jain are very busy at Northwestern, so thank you both for joining us to share the latest and greatest information. As always, make sure to stay in contact with your care center team, as well as look at cff.org for the latest COVID-19 information. And thank you to all of us, thank you to everybody that joined us today to participate, and hopefully you got some good information out of this, and we'll look forward to bringing you more CF Town Halls with our care center partners in 2021. So stay tuned for our upcoming events and engagement opportunities. So thank you all again, and with that, I will say goodbye.